And welcome to Serenity in Leadership's series on leading responsibly with integrity and purpose. A series dedicated to conversations with people who are shining examples of this kind of leadership. I'm Thom, the CEO of Serenity in Leadership. Today I'm delighted to welcome Avivah Wittenberg-Cox to the podcast. Avivah specialises in generational and gender balance in the future of work. As a consultant, writer and speaker, she works with CEOs and executives who want to rethink and update their diversity approaches and strategically balance their businesses. She facilitates what she describes as politically incorrect debates, which I think is a great description.
Avivah, much needed in our days and times.
So welcome.
Thank you. Lovely to be here, Thom.
So you have many areas of interest in terms of leadership, but as I mentioned, you have two particular focus areas that are so important in the workplace right now: gender and generational balance. So let's start with what you call the longevity revolution. Why are aging at work and the balance between generations so significant right now?
Well, it's not exactly a new topic. Demographics is the one thing that you can really see coming in the data decades before it hits. But since it hadn't entirely hit until now, I think what we're seeing is just the arrival of the topic into the mainstream, into the media. It's very much affected, I think, by COVID, where we lost a lot of older people in very dire circumstances, which was a bit of a wake-up call for the world on how we manage older age. And then I think just because the demographics of our planet are shifting quite dramatically from what I call pyramids to squares. So we're going from, a few old people and a lot of young people to an equivalent number of old and young, which is something we've never seen in the history of our species. So it's like huge. It's really, really big. And it's not really on most people's radar at all. It's not really framed in that way. It's been, I think, kind of set in the rather dull backyard of the actuaries and the insurance companies who've known about this for a long time, about pension debates and financing of pensions. But now, as you can see in countries like France and Russia and elsewhere, it's coming into the street and people are being asked to retire later than they expected, and that's a huge shock. We will hear much more about this topic in the next 20 years.
Yeah, and I think there's a funny sort of confusion about birth rates. I think there's this assumption that there's loads and loads of more people being born, but actually in an awful lot of countries, it's gone in quite the reverse direction, hasn't it?
Birth rates have been absolutely tumbling for the last 20 years. There's only in sub-Saharan Africa where they still have relatively high birth rates, and even those are falling much faster than people expected. So it's been an unexpected, rapid demographic evolution, both in terms of people living longer more suddenly. So there's fast aging countries, particularly middle income countries, are aging much faster than they used to because people are living longer more suddenly than in our more developed economies. And at the same time, we've got this incredible fall in birth rates. I always say that women are voting with their wombs, and we have not adapted the world of work or home to the reality of women's lives, making childbirth and families quite a difficult calculation. So those two forces are completely reshaping our shared future demographically. And demographics is always a really big issue. It has consequences, as I always say, on couples, companies, and countries, my 3 C's.
So, looking at the second of those, if companies will need to ensure that their 5-generation workforce thrives during their ever longer careers, I suppose what we want is for the different generations to not be competing, but utilizing their skills to collaborate to make business better. How can leaders bring out the best in workers across the generations, do you think?
Well, I think that's the heart of the matter, right? It's which reminds me very much of the work I've been doing for the last 20 years on gender balance, right? How do leaders and managers help people work across differences of all kinds, whether it's gender or generations? And I think it's a skill that needs building, right? It's not a natural understanding that we have. And the world is profoundly ageist. We are ageist deeply internally, even against ourselves. We're not very attracted to our own future selves. We don't find that an aspirational look. And companies have been notorious for letting go of anybody over 50 for quite some time, particularly some sectors like the tech sector or the advertising sector, some that very much lean youthful. That doesn't work so well in a world where the youth pipeline is drying up and where we actually have to get much better at understanding what are the needs, motivations of the over 50 workforce compared to the under 50 workforce. And that will require, well, a little bit of putting it on the agenda, which it isn't, learning what these people want, how to manage them, how career cycles can adapt to 60-year careers, and how we're going to manage in organizations that also have a very different demographic shape. And that will take a lot of awareness building and skilling up for managers who have to manage these multiple generations. We've never really had 5 generations in the workforce before.
No. So what 2 or 3 pieces of advice do you give companies to modernize again against anti-ageist attitudes, which they may well not even be conscious of having? And do different generation leaders have to look at this differently?
Well, I think there's a similarity in, I think, how they have to look at it, with curiosity, openness, and a willingness to learn about differences across generations and what the impact of those are. And the first thing that I think organizations have to do is understand how much of an issue this is for their own organization. How many people in their own organizations are over 50? How many of them are likely to retire within the next 10 years? What share of your workforce may be heading out the door, and what knowledge do those people hold that you may need to keep within your organization? And have you managed the knowledge transfer and the succession planning? Or have you built in systems where you can retain and develop older talent? That's the work of the next decade.
So looking at your other specialism, gender balance, here we are in 2023, and we know there is still enormous amounts of work to be done. But what are the reasons to feel optimistic?
Well, listen, I do a lot of measuring and working with organizations, and I watch their stats evolve. I've been on this topic for 20 years, and the world of today is nothing like the world of 20 years ago. When I started, there was not a single woman on the executive teams of any of the French CAC 40. I was living in France at the time. There were almost none on the UK top teams. And that has completely changed. We are now seeing balance on boards and leadership, and we're also seeing almost a rebalancing in the other direction in terms of entrance into the pipeline. Women are now the majority of the educated talent around the planet. They get 60% of university degrees. They are an ever enriched portion of the consumer decision-making base. And they wield increasing political and economic power in all kinds of areas. And so we've just watched this power grow. We've also watched the backlash against this rise of women grow. We got lots of nasty authoritarian leaders pushing women back in their place in their countries. But I think we've made very notable progress. You can see just by looking around the world today who runs the European Commission, the US Fed, the World Bank, the IMF. We've got some really great female role models. My question now is, who are the great male role models, and what are we doing about building them?
Yes.
Leadership.
Yes.
We need more serenity, and we don't have it with the leaders we have today.
Yes, we've done a lot of very recent exploring of masculinity in the workplace and what that means and how to advance that.
Huge, right? Huge, like and it's very interesting, all the work I've done on gender. It's the problem isn't men or women, right? The problem is a very narrow definition of what those things mean, and that the fact that the workplace has remained rather strangely normed on some of these extreme masculine traits that even men don't really want. So there are still a few men who want to keep this in place, but the vast majority of the workforce wants it to evolve. Men, women, young, old, parents. I call them the sum total of the millennials, the perennials, and the parents would like to see the workplace evolve and flex. And I think COVID gave us all hope and technology to allow that to happen. Now we have to see if mindsets shift and keep pace.
And I guess how we can help those mindsets shift in the most strategic places. But I've read that you think we need to stop fixing women, stop blaming men, and start empowering leaders to lead the change, which is, I guess, what we've been saying. So what do you think leaders need to do to get gender balance right? Because I think many leaders are sitting at their desks, scratching their heads.
Well, I think, we're 2023. If you're not gender balanced now, stop doing what you're doing because it didn't work. And let's look for some new ideas and new solutions. Don't just copy paste what everybody else is doing, which is very often what I call these fix the women strategies, right? The question starts with, oh dear, we don't have enough women in leadership. What's the matter with them? Let's help them. Let's coach them or build their confidence or, send them on a leadership program for women, as though somehow it's women that are the problem of the lack of gender balance in leadership. So I think those might have been useful in the 20th century. I think we're now in the 21st century. It's time to let that go. I also think it's time to let go all this kind of blaming men, unconscious bias training, telling men that they're bad and privileged and too white, too pale, too male, too stale. I mean, that's not a good way to get people on board to a gender balancing initiative. And so what I mean by empowering leaders is, to me, gender balance is entirely a leadership skill and challenge. You have to know how to do this. It's delicate, it's emotive, it's complex. And you have to understand what the issues are facing both the men and women in your organization, as well as the 52 other genders now on offer that makes more than one head scratch, right? This is not easy stuff. And in my experience with leadership teams, they're a bit scared. They're very uncomfortable. They don't want to be on the front page of the newspaper saying the wrong thing. And interestingly, there's really no place for them to learn. When we have a day to discuss these things, very often the feedback I get is that's the first time they have had a serious conversation with each other about how to do this gender stuff. That's crazy, right?
Yes. And it is actually something that we're doing right now, is offering to organizations to create a space for men to actually come and learn some of this stuff. But do it in such a way that they feel safe enough that they'll engage, because the moment you say, come on, men, let's talk about this, that's the last thing they want to do.
That's not, and that's interestingly, I think that's really what people think. That's what a lot of women think. And it's not my experience at all. I think the issue is who's talking about it. Yeah, if you start and I'm not actually a big believer necessarily either in getting a bunch of middle managers to go talk about masculinity today. I think that would make many of them dramatically uncomfortable. But to get an ExCo team together to discuss how balance will affect their business over the next 5 years, and do they have the skills and understanding they need in order to build this balance or accelerate it if they want to? They love this stuff. Are you kidding? It's not like they don't have wives and daughters and colleagues, and it's usually not just men, right? Usually these conversations on an ExCo team will have some women, because there are now some women on these ExCo teams, not always. And my experience of this is it's an enormous relief to have a time and a place to explore these issues with your peers, to try and understand how much of a priority is this for your business, not as some nice to have moral issue, but just who is our talent, who are our customers, who are our stakeholders, and do we reflect them adequately? Um, and I very often bundled this topic of gender and generational balance with the issue of nationality balance, because in a lot of international companies, they have a similar issue, right? They're very often dominated by a single nationality, a single gender, and a single generation. And if they want to mix that up, they're going to have to do it with intent and prioritization. But I don't find any resistance. I really don't.
Mm.
But that's because they lead. These are the guys who've made it, right? They have nothing to lose. They're in power. They're running the show. Skill them up and make them look good and help them balance. And then they make it okay for all the men in the organization to feel much more comfortable about these topics. But it's got to come from, I really, in male organizations, this idea of working middle up or bottom up, I don't buy it. You guys are hierarchical in your bones and DNA programming, and you won't do it if the head honcho doesn't show the way. That's the challenge.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I mean, there's some change projects that can work from the edges and work in, but not this one.
Not this one. I agree. It's like, this is a tricky one. And men, I mean, to me, the whole issue of gender, particularly in the 20th century, was about getting women to rise. In the 21st century, it's all about men on men. It's getting men to let other men evolve, become fathers, take parental leave, manage their own work-life balance and learn how to be modern men, both at work and at home. And
Mm.
they can't do that without the organization allowing it and supporting it.
Yeah, I think there's also a piece about role models and really understanding, accepting that leaders in organizations, whether they like it or not, are role models. And since there are so few role models for young men in society, I think that there's an additional responsibility that really needs to be picked up by the corporate world to show young men what it's like to be a good man.
I agree. And I actually, like, very interestingly, I think particularly large multinational companies are hotbeds of difference. They're wonderful. I mean, they have been working for decades quite successfully at uniting people of very different backgrounds, very different nationalities, very different religions and races all over the place. And some of them do it incredibly well. And I find them actually quite inspiring leaders that you don't necessarily hear about, but their teams know about it. And I think they are effective role models in some companies more than others. And you can always feel it in a corporate culture, right? The kind of leaders that they have and whether or not they're aspirational. And I think good leaders are aspirational across genders, right? Doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman or another gender. A good leader speaks and includes everyone. They manage to unite across differences, which is desperately needed in our world today.
Yes, and that's not a skill that many leadership programs explore.
At all.
Yeah.
At all. And gender is not on the agenda of any business school I know.
Well, it is on ours. We're designing a new leadership program at the moment, and for me, I think it's so important this, and what we've done is to create it so that the first thing is know thyself, and the second step is lead thyself, and then start to look outwards, because I think there's such a need for leaders to have an understanding of their own dynamic and what they're doing and what they're reacting to and what their unconscious drivers are. I think this is just so important. And as you say, I've been doing some research and I haven't found any organizations that are really addressing this. So I think
I
it's
think they address it in a sideways way, right? I've been a coach for 20 years and have coached many leaders. I mean, and most executive teams of, decent sized companies now have coach. I mean, they almost all have coaches. But, you know, whether they get everything they need, the 360 feedback tool is very useful for building self-awareness. The more that's embedded into the culture, the better. So I think we've made some progress on that. But I think, there are still a lot of organizations that rule by hierarchy and a degree of fear, and they don't really want to hear or listen to feedback on their own styles of leadership. Those are the bad places.
yeah, and there's plenty of those. And I've seen a lot of leaders who are at the top, and it's very easy to point the finger and say that department needs fixing, as opposed to saying, well, what's my role in this? What am I doing? How am I creating a problem? And perhaps I should sort myself out before I try and expect some of these departments to do this. And you talk about fear. I think there is always this, or not always, but often this element of fear at the top, which is that the people in the C-suite look down the organization and they see these people coming up and they say, I could never have done that. And it's kind of a bit scary to look at really talented people coming up, and you get a little bit of imposter syndrome at the top levels, and people get scared about being exposed. Whereas actually, it's so much better if they just engage with this and say, "I can still learn. What can I do? How do I become a better role model, a better leader?" Right at the top. Just because I've got here doesn't mean to say I've got nothing to learn.
Listen, I've spent the last almost 20 years now in these exco teams, and it's really interesting to me how often they don't even know anything about each other. They don't know how many kids, what their wives do. I mean, I go around the room asking them, what do their wives do? What kind of kids do they have? What gender are their children? Let's make this personal a little bit. And how often I have heard that this is the first time they've discovered all of this is deeply shocking, right? And so these ideas that have emerged of psychological safety in teams starts at the top. If these guys aren't even talking to each other, knowing each other, or able to, reveal their fears and help each other, it's a pretty dire lifestyle.
Yes, we really agree on this. So where does the LGBTQ plus community come into this when we talk about gender balance, with a growing movement that is redefining what gender is, and the new generation of workers expecting full diversity and gender equality in a completely different way?
Well, I'd say that's a very geographically relevant question. And since I work a lot around the globe, that doesn't table similarly everywhere. So I think you need to be very careful about suddenly throwing out the old binaries in cultures and with people who hold to those kinds of things. And I think that's where a lot of skill is required and a lot of data. I'm always quite intrigued to what's the data. I always base everything on data. How many men, women, and other genders and non-binary do you have in your talent pool, in your customer base? Have you counted? Do you know? They don't even know often how many men and women they have, let alone the other dimensions. And so it's always a question of what's the weight of these different groups. The same is true for now. We do exactly the same work for gender, for generations and nationality. What countries do you make your greatest sales in? Where does most of your growth come from? Do you have people from that country in your leadership pipeline? And that too requires a certain degree of measuring and counting. So all of this to me is data driven, I would say, before you leap to throwing out everything that's ever been done. Take a look at how important is it and where are you? Because those conversations are a lot easier in New York than they are in Cape Town, let me tell you.
Yeah. I remember facilitating a C team once, and it was an engineering company. And between the engineers and the finance people, that was pretty much the whole team. And they were bemoaning there was not a lot of innovation. So I just said, okay, so tell me, who are the key creatives in your business? And they had no idea. There was not one name they could offer up. So I think this sense of diversity and understanding difference in the organization at the top levels is really, really important. And as you say, measuring these things, or even having the awareness to say, yes, we need to measure these things, is kind of really important.
And I think, listen, every manager I've ever interviewed said they're all agreed. They all agree that what they're after is diversity of thought. But I think there's lots and lots of research to show that no, they're not. They're into conformity of thought and groupthink, and they recruit and hire and promote people that look and sound like them because that's what we are programmed to be more comfortable with. So I think the whole issue of differences and exploring them, learning them, bringing them in is a strategic choice, right? It doesn't have to be done. And I think we have to learn from the backlash of the last 7 years that we can't go faster than people are ready to do because it hits us in the face, which is what we're experiencing now, right? And so that's where the leadership skill comes in. How do you build inclusion skills? For what? At what pace? In what place? And know what you're doing. Don't just copy paste what some American companies are doing because it works in the US, which is a very particular market.
Isn't it? Yes.
I'm tired. I'm tired of the copy pasting. Bless them, great. I love the diversity of the US. I come from Canada. We're even more diverse. But know where you're putting your feet and don't promote. It's also, I find, I'm a big arguer for this as a business and leadership issue, not a moral and values-based one. And I get very uncomfortable with people starting to preach their morals around the world to other people, because I'm not sure they have a right to do so.
No. Yes, I was coaching someone this morning, fun enough, and I was challenging this what they used to call the golden rule. Treat everybody as you would have them treat you, and
well, that's a mistake. Yeah,
just doesn't work. You've got to turn it around. You've got to treat everybody. Well, the first thing is to find out who you're talking to and what's special and meaningful for them, and then look at ways in which you can treat them in that way. And that requires a flexibility and an openness of thinking, which
big problem on the gender front and on the cultural front, right? Treat people as you want to be treated just does not work. If we are truly different, we want to be treated. I mean, that was the mistake, of course, of equality, to be treated exactly equal and the same. And what we've learned over the last 20 or 30 years is we want to be treated equally and equitably, which means understanding the differences and adjusting your leadership style to the audience and culture that you're engaging with. Very different exercise.
Yeah, definitely. So a final question. If at the heart of this is acceptance, diversity, and belonging, what 3 ways can we avoid talking ourselves and others down and instead role model gender balance to future generations?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't call it diversity. I don't consider women to be a diversity dimension, and it's one of the words that I fight against. If you want to model the reality of the talent pool and the customer base, it's put women back where they belong, which is the majority of a lot of talent and a lot of markets, which means you're going to try and reflect your talent and markets. You're going to try and balance to be equivalent to the people you're trying to serve and work with. So I think words and frames matter a lot.
Yeah.
And I think gender diversity is an oxymoron. Let's update our vocabulary and approaches for the 21st century. That would be wonderful.
Yes, yeah. I can hear some people saying, well, it's taken us so far to such a lot of work to get to where we are, and now you're telling us that that's not the right place. And it's like, but yeah, I have this image in my mind of people being. Some people talk about the marginalized groups, and in many places, women are one of those groupings. And my sense really is that we need to challenge the whole concept of what's normal, because it's the majority that decides what normal is, and then they dictate it, even if it's unconsciously, on everybody else. And that's what creates all these marginalized groups.
Yeah, it's the old in and out, right? Who's in, who's out, and who says. And the in people never think they're in. And the only people who know who's the in group is the out people who don't feel like they're in. It's a mess. It's a mess. I think we've gotten ourselves into a mess. So when you say, well, when we've come this far, blah, 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 how can we change everything? I think we've learned a lot, especially from the last 7 years, that there's tremendous amounts of things we did wrong. And it's time to adapt our approaches, to fine tune them, to make them more sophisticated for a very complex world on some very hot button topics. And we have to learn all together how to talk and converse across our differences. Otherwise, we're all going to go down together.
Yes, I do hear a lot of people sort of saying, because I so remember when I was in Houston at one of these huge conferences, and I went to an ethics lecture, and this guy introduced it by saying, right, well, everybody who needs this acknowledged for their advancement, come to me at the end, and I'll tick it, because there's this whole thing about you've got to attend one ethics lecture a year, and this tick in the box sort of mindset, and then they apply this to whatever you like to call it, diversity and inclusion and all these things. And I read a book a while back, and I think they were saying it's something like $6 billion is being spent each year on DE&I, and almost all of it is wasted because there is this sort of tick in the box attitude.
I mean, listen, I always find it's really easy to check a company. Just look at their executive team. What do they look like? And you have your answer. If they're all one nationality, one gender, and usually one dominant educational background, you know that they still have some work to do on this front. Yeah. Or that they've really strategically decided to ignore it, which some companies have truly decided to do. Yeah. Because there is a backlash, and some people are even legislating against some of these kinds of policies now, right? So this progressive wave that we were on for decades has morphed into a bit of a monster, and we all need to rethink with a bit of humble self-doubt on what we're saying, and find maybe new ways to say it and new ways to engage.
Well, on that thought, Avivah, thank you so much. I really hope that helps some people, sort of, it opens their thinking a little bit to some of the mindsets that they have. I really appreciate you exploring this with me. It's been great.
Well, and you'd be surprised. I mean, this kind of conversation with an executive team, the number one feedback I get is just a sense of relief that they can finally have an honest conversation to try and understand what is going on and what they should do about it. Yeah. Yeah. It's mind terrain these days, so let's help demine.
Dangerous but important work. Thank you, Avivah.
My pleasure. Lovely being with you.